Verily I say, this is the day in which mankind can behold the face and hear the voice of the promised one. The call of God hath been raised, and the light of his countenance hath been lifted up upon men. It behooveth every man to blot out the trace of every idle word from the tablet of his heart, and to gaze with an open and unbiased mind on the signs of his revelation, the proofs of his mission, and the tokens of his glory. Great indeed is this day. The allusions made to it in all the sacred scriptures as a day of God attest its greatness. The soul of every prophet of God, of every divine messenger, hath thirsted for this wondrous day. All the diverse kindreds of the earth have likewise yearned to attain it. No sooner, however, had the day star of his revelation manifested itself in the heaven of God's will, than all except those whom the Almighty was pleased to guide were found dumbfounded and heedless. Baha'u'llah.
So our speaker this week is Dr. Kendal Williams, and his topic is Why the Baha'i Faith is a Really Big Deal. Dr. Kendal Williams is a professor of medicine at the University of Pennsylvania and the editor of the Baha'i website sifterofdust.org. He studied at Haverford College before attending Penn Medical School, and then completed his residency and chief residency at the University of Pittsburgh before returning to Penn as faculty. He is a general internist by training and the founding director of the Penn Center for Evidence-Based Practice. He is now the host of the Penn Primary Care podcast and continues to perform clinical work and teach at Penn. And with that, I'll hand it off to Dr. Williams.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning in to hear my thoughts today. I have had the opportunity to give I guess a few presentations in this forum and really enjoyed it, and I hope others have enjoyed it as well. So I'm happy to be back. So my topic is, why the Baha'i Faith is a really big deal. And, there's this disconnect from those of us who are Baha'is, I think, between how we think about the Baha'i Faith and how the world thinks about the Baha'i Faith. And a lot of what, us as Baha'is are trying to communicate to the world is that we know this is a small religion. We know that a lot of you probably haven't heard about it, but this is actually a really big deal. And I would argue maybe that there's nothing more important than you'll hear about in your lifetime than the Baha'i Faith. On some level, that I believe that to be true. So I want to go through why I believe that to be the case. And most of this is really going to be me telling the story, if you will, of how I came to recognize this as a really big deal and sort of the intellectual and spiritual journey I went through to appreciate more and more the depth of what this faith is all about, which is pretty magnificent. There we go. Sorry about that. So I just want to tell you a little bit about my story. I grew up in a town in rural Pennsylvania called Tunkhannock. My father had become a Baha'i probably before I was born, I think so, or around about that time. He had learned about it when he was studying in Philadelphia. And my uncles also became Baha'is and an aunt. And my mother died when I was very young, when I was 5, of breast cancer. And so me and my 2 brothers were largely raised by our grandparents, who took a large role in raising us, as my father was running a business and so forth. And so my grandmother insisted that we all go to church if she was going to raise us, and she did not like the fact that all of her children had become Baha'is. And so she wanted us to our generation to go to church. So I attended this church growing up. And, to be honest with you, we were in a small Baha'i community. And, we went to church every Sunday. So if you had asked me maybe when I was 12 or 13 years old, what religion did I consider myself, I would say probably that I was Christian, partly because I also wanted to fit in with everybody else around me who was Christian. But my father would take us every summer in August for a week up to a Baha'i school in Maine that many of you know called Greenacre. And we would spend the summer weeks there. And we would my dad was very, I don't want to say cheap. He was economical. Let's just say that. So we would always stay at the campground, And we had this old tent that was like this circus tent, and we'd all, sit in there, and the only time we used the tent is when we went to Greenacre. And so we'd put it up a week before we went and air it out, and then take it up there in this musty old tent. And then we'd lie on these air mattresses, and they weren't like the new air mattresses that really hold their air pretty well. These were like the type that when you laid on them at night, by the morning you're on the ground, and we got caught in the rain. And that was our experience going to Greenacre Bahá'í School, but it was great fun. And I met people from all over the world. I had really positive feelings about the Baha'is. They were wonderful people, and they were very engaged, and they really wanted to change the world. And it was just this wonderful, positive environment. But to be honest to you, I got to be 14 or 15 years old, and I really hadn't quite keyed into what the Baha'i faith was. And I remember sitting in this drafty old tent with my dad, and one day we're lying on these air mattresses, and I said, "Can you explain this to me a little bit? I mean, who's Baha'u'llah, who's Abdu'l-Baha, who are these people that everybody keeps talking about?" And so, he started to explain it to me. And then, then I started to study and learn a little bit more. And when I was 16 or 17, I got very serious. And, it's just this age of you're coming to maturity and starting to ask your own questions about the world. And I started to read the Baha'i writings and read them more intently, and ever more intently as I became very stimulated. And I was caught up in a movement that happened in the mid-'80s. After the execution of some young Baha'i women in Iran, there was the youth around the world really rose up in response to that, because these young women were our age in many ways. And, Mona, who it was, sort of the most well-known of these women, was actually my age. And so, I really, it really sort of stimulated me to learn more about this faith and to start to serve it. And that's at that point that I began to really appreciate what it was and see that it was a big deal. And so let me tell you that story. So let me just tell you what the Baha'i faith is up front. We're just going to get the basics out of the way. I want this to be a talk that's introductory, but we're going to go a little deeper on some of the main points. So the basic truths of the Baha'i faith. The Baha'i faith is a monotheistic religion. There's one God who is the ultimate source of all reality. That God is unknowable to us in any absolute sense, but that God does exist, and everything we see is a reflection of the qualities of God, in a similar way that a painting is a reflection of the qualities of the painter. What's unique about the Baha'i faith is that it is the most universal religion that humanity has ever known. It says that all of the great religions, and there are many religions in the world and so forth. What I mean are the great religions, that we all know, that have spread around the world, that these great religions of humankind have come from the same God, and each of them is a reflection of the divine will, meaning they were expressions of the will of God for their time in history. But because the world is always evolving and changing, the revelations of God also change and adapt their standards to the age in which they appear. So there's really, for Baha'is, only one religion of God, except it's been manifested in these great messengers, prophets. Baha'is call them manifestations of God, because that's what Baha'u'llah referred to them, because they manifest the qualities of God, make obvious, manifest the qualities of God in creation, in the world that we understand. And so these messengers of God, really, they're not God, but they're God to us, right? They manifest the qualities of God to humanity. And all of these messengers, whether it be Moses, Jesus, the Prophet Muhammad, even the great, the Buddha, and different, we have these different sort of lines of religion, whether it be in India or other places. But, the history, human history is very vast, right? 200,000 years. We only know about 2,000 or 3,000. So there's a lot of it we don't really actually know much about, but we believe that there's been religions and God has sent messengers throughout time to humanity. So Baha'u'llah's revelation, Baha'u'llah's teachings represent the standards of God for our time in history. They are, this is the same religion. This is Christianity renewed. This is the religion of Islam renewed. Baha'u'llah did not claim to reveal so much a new religion as the renewal of religion itself. And, you know, the pivot, as it's described, the pivot of his religion, of his message for our time in history, is the oneness of humankind, the oneness of humanity, starting to understand ourselves as part of one global community. And then to build peace in that community. And then on a day when a war has broken out in Israel effectively, and we're watching a war unfold before our eyes between Russia and Ukraine, you know, this is a time where all of these issues that Baha'u'llah revealed and spoke to directly really can be, we can see how important they are. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about Baha'u'llah. Baha'u'llah claimed to be the bearer of a revelation from God from our time in history. And as I said, he explained that all the previous revelations were from the same God. God is the God of all, and that all things are of God. So this is not a situation where some people are godly and other people are not. Everything reflects to different degrees the qualities of God. Everything is good in that sense. All people are good. All cultures are good. It's just the degree of the reflection of their attributes of God. And those attributes of God are really the principles and teachings of the messengers of God. Like, for instance, compassion, love, justice, fairness. And, you know, we can appreciate that different cultures reflect those qualities more than others, but all people have the capacity to reflect that, and therefore are all of God. Baha'u'llah said something, I think, actually quite revolutionary and important, and that is that the purpose of religion is unity. It's not to wear a tribal identity and to set yourself out as different. The purpose of the entire process of religion has been to uphold unity. And a concept that I'm very attracted to is that Baha'u'llah has really brought back religion into the realm of rationality. We can now understand religion. It makes sense. It's coherent. Baha'u'llah himself, you know, was made rational arguments for the reasons for his faith and so forth. So, you know, it's really a faith that's based on rationality and praises science. And for Baha'is, science is a spiritual enterprise, really. So, you know, it's a very unifying religion of many different aspects of our world. I want to mention this person, and we're going to talk about Baha'u'llah quite a bit. Baha'u'llah's picture we do not show, but you will see pictures of Abdu'l-Baha if you're new to the faith. Abdu'l-Baha is Baha'u'llah's son. He was the example that Baha'u'llah gave us, really. He explained so much about the nature of Baha'u'llah's teachings. He described himself only as a servant. He was just this wonderful example of service leadership. And he described himself as, my station is the station of servitude, a servitude which is complete, pure, and real, firmly established, enduring, obvious, explicitly revealed, and subject to no interpretation whatever. Abdu'l-Baha is, you know, one of the most majestic and important figures in all of human history. Nobody knows about him yet in the way that they will come to know him with time. We in this country, in the US, had the bounty of having Abdu'l-Baha on our shores. He gave talks throughout churches and other venues in 1912 when he came to this country. This is a picture of him in a talk in Chicago at a very large church, and explaining, and the quote, we won't go into it at the moment, but the quote on the side is explaining the idea of the oneness of religion, and how each of the religions can be seen as a sun that rises in the sky, and that they come from different places. They come from different points on the horizon as the year evolves. And so even though this the religions are different, they really represent the same light, the same sun, simply arising at different points on the horizon because of the time of which they lived. Okay, so the Baha'i faith has grown since the time of Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha. There's over 7 million Baha'is in the world. It is, and this is quite remarkable to say, but true, it is the most diverse single community of people on the planet. When the Baha'is have their election for their the International Council that leads the Baha'i faith, the Universal House of Justice, which we do every 5 years, It is the largest democratic election in the world. And so you have this enormously diverse universal religion established in almost all of the countries of the world, increasingly encompassing more and more of the peoples of the world. So even though it's a small religion, its diversity is very distinctive. We are mostly in smaller communities. So not all communities are small. Some have larger Baha'i centers and hundreds of people. Many of us practice our faith within smaller communities, villages, and towns, and so forth. But we are part of a global community spread in thin veneer, if you will, all over the earth. And it's quite remarkable once you learn about the Baha'i community, how diverse it is. There are a number of structures that the Baha'is have built, houses of worship around the world that have achieved some fame. This is the Lotus Temple in New Delhi, India. It is the most visited tourist attraction in India. That is my understanding, with 10,000 visitors a day. It is shaped as a lotus flower and really to reflect the spirituality of India. And that's an iconic symbol within Indian spirituality. And Baha'is have built their house of worship as a way of inviting all people to come worship there. So some people know of the Baha'i faith through having run into, if you will, these various temples. So the ideas of the Baha'i faith are really simple to understand, very intuitive, right? There's one God. All the great religions of the world, we can splice and dice their differences, but at the end of the day, they all reflect one great religion, and there's one human family, and we need to recognize that, and we need to move forward as a planet collectively together. Three onenesses, as we call them in the Baha'i faith: one God, one great religion, one human family. And when I say one religion, I don't mean the Baha'i faith. I mean the Baha'i faith being another chapter in the book of the great religion of God. Okay, the concept that I want to focus on today, because I think there's many ways that the Baha'i faith is a really big deal, but the one I think that really struck me, because I think it's the core of it, is this idea of the oneness of religion and the progressive revelation of truth, because that is a really important and significant idea. So I want to talk about the oneness of religion primarily. So let's just go over the core ideas. And I mentioned this earlier, but to drive it home, the revelations of God, the prophet Moses, the prophet, Jesus, who's not regarded as a prophet, I know, the prophet Muhammad, and so forth, they have the same source and purpose, that of the unity and spiritual and moral development of all people. They are, and this is a key, I think, the revelations of God are revealed according to the capacity of humanity at that time in history. So if we look back at the Bible or the Quran and we feel like it's not modern, it's not, it's just not for us or whatever, I would argue there are elements of it that are very much for us. There are eternal elements in those scriptures, but there's also certainly an aspect that does pertain to that time and we're not able to relate to. That's fine. That doesn't mean it's untrue, right? That's part of the Baha'i understanding of religion, that it's evolutionary. And so looking at a religion from the earliest time, from earlier times, for us as modern people, it's normal to think that it looks, it's different. So you have in this religion a concept of religion itself being evolutionary, right? It's fundamental to the Baha'i faith. Evolution, the transformation of things over time, and needing to be renewed, is fundamental to the Baha'i religion. Okay, so all these religions are different from each other because the specifics of their teachings are time-based, depending on the history, but their mode of presentation, even their language, other things that make them different. So Jesus revealed in a very different way than the Prophet Muhammad did. And each of those distinctions are meaningful, but they did it in the way that was most appropriate for their time in history. That's true of Baha'u'llah as well. Baha'u'llah's language and tone and everything else, and the expressions he uses, some of them reflect the place in which he revealed his religion, right? Despite these differences, the underlying truth of all these great revelations is the same, and they all they all represent the word of God. And they have a character and a quality that is distinctive from other words. There's no question about that. Okay, in this time in history, we're supposed to come to a point where we see them all as part of this one religion of God and not separate ourselves based on the superficial aspects of religion. So, and religion's purpose is as a unifier, right? Okay, now the other part of this story is Baha'u'llah's claims himself, right? Because Baha'u'llah was not only explaining to us how religion worked, if you will, right? What it's really about, that it's evolutionary and progressive and so forth, but also he was claiming a new revelation from God. In fact, a very significant new revelation from God. And so, this quote from Baha'u'llah saying, his revelation, the revelation which from time immemorial has been acclaimed as the purpose and promise of the prophets of the God and the most cherished desire of his messengers, has now by virtue of the pervasive will of the Almighty, and at his irresistible bidding, been revealed unto men. Baha'u'llah says it explicitly throughout his writings with no, just in this way and in many other passages, that this is a revelation of God. It represents the standards of God for our time in history. And that's how we all need to grow up. If somebody claims to be another religion, but they're following Baha'i standards, it doesn't, we're all part of the same standards. We all live in the same world. And no matter what we call ourselves, the standards are the same for us to be, to be doing the will of God for our time in history. So part of that is that we don't separate each other based on religion and fight amongst each other based on religion. That's not the will of God for humanity, as we'll see. But so there's no justification for that, for instance, in the modern world. So that these ideas that Baha'u'llah revealed have very real world meanings that, I'm constantly looking at the world and understanding that, if we were to follow what Baha'u'llah had given us as guidelines, that we would have such a much more peaceful world. And so much of what is wrong in the world is that people are following old standards that are no longer relevant to the modern day, of different forms. Okay, so I would argue as well that, these ideas that Baha'u'llah revealed and this concept of progressive revelation means that we need to really step back and rethink religion entirely. So, my exposure to growing up as a Christian and also as a Baha'i, and then, embracing the Baha'i faith, my experience with religion is extraordinarily positive, right? I've met highly intelligent, thoughtful people who were deeply religious, who could explain their religion. I never thought that there was any real barrier between science and religion that was baked into our belief system. I never found evolution to be a challenging idea from a Baha'i perspective. A lot of these things that people trip up with and they go away from religion, Baha'is don't have priests. I've never had issues with clergy, so my experience of religion has been extremely positive, extremely dynamic, extremely modern in many ways. And so, I think that, and I tell folks, who are learning about religion, I say, listen, you really need to study the Baha'i faith if you want to understand religion, because when people complain about religion to me based on their own experiences, I can't really relate. That's not the experience that we've had as Baha'is. And so I think for a lot of folks, what I asked you to do is to, as was said in the beginning quote of this presentation, we need to look upon religion with an open and unbiased mind. We need to now rethink, any of the divisiveness we see in between religion. That's not what we want. That's not what God wants either. So, I think that, we really need to rethink our standards and sort of bring them in line with what we're told is what God really wants for us. So, all right. I feel like I've talked too much in these early portions, so I'm going to need to speed up here. The first thing that struck me, and I remember I was just learning about the Baha'i faith, just coming to consciousness about what it all was. And one of the Baha'is in one of our meetings said about Baha'u'llah being the return of Christ. And I turned to him, I said, Baha'u'llah is the return of Christ? I didn't know that. I mean, that struck me very much. I mean, I'd heard these wonderful ideas and so forth, but it hadn't been framed to me in that way. And so my first moment to realize that the Baha'i Faith was a really big deal was when it dawned on me that his claim was actually that he was the return of Christ. Now, I grew up in rural Pennsylvania in a Christian society. A lot of the folks I knew were still actively Christian. And so, I saw signs on churches about Jesus was coming back and so forth. And the fact that this idea that he'd already come back was a big deal. And it's a big deal for everyone and it's a big deal for Christians, but it also validates their religion. So that was the first thing that struck me, was that Jesus has returned already. And it happened over a century ago. And coming to terms with that. So I want to talk about, and so a lot of my early questions about the Baha'i Faith as I was studying it had to do from that Christian perspective. So I want to step back and talk about Christ, because I think that understanding Christ, not as a mythical figure, but as a real figure, what did he actually say? What did he actually claim? Is very important to understanding what Baha'u'llah is. Because if Baha'u'llah is the return of Christ, we can understand now what Baha'u'llah is going to impact he's going to have upon the world, and his teachings are about, and basically the power that's in the faith that he has revealed. So, I did want to mention this quote. One of these quotes, this struck me very much when I was learning about the faith. It's a quote of Baha'u'llah where he says, "The ancient beauty has consented to be bound with chains that mankind may be released from its bondage, and has accepted to be made a prisoner in his most mighty stronghold." He's referring to the prison that Baha'u'llah was in for over 40 years. This prison he wasn't over 40 years in this prison, but he was over 40 years total imprisonment and spent a number of decades in this prison. And he said, the ancient beauty, meaning God has consented to be bound here, that the whole world may be attained unto true liberty. He has drained to its dregs the cup of sorrow, that all the peoples of the earth may attain unto abiding joy and be filled with gladness. And this idea that it was sort of reminiscent of a Christian idea that God had come into the world again. God had consented to be made a prisoner or to be crucified, that all the peoples of the world may benefit, right? And so Baha'u'llah said the same thing. And of course, we know that that's how we view Christ as well. Baha'u'llah said his claims were not subtle, and he made them for 40 years throughout many tablets, despite persecution of him and his followers and his family. He wrote tablets to the kings and rulers of the earth that said, "You are vassals." A vassal is a servant. He says, "You are servants, O kings, for he who is the King of kings has appeared, arrayed in his most wondrous glory, and is summoning you to himself." So, Baha'u'llah is not subtle. This was a clear claim. He made it throughout his life and stayed firm with it through some of the most magnificent tablets. And the tablets of Baha'u'llah to the kings are going to go down in history as some of the most remarkable and significant tablets or religious writing in all of history. Humanity doesn't know about them yet, but they're amazing. Okay, let's talk about Christ, because I want to use Christ to understand Baha'u'llah. So Jesus comes into the world in 0 AD. I think it was actually about 3 years off. And he described his role as a teacher, right? He was referred to as a teacher, as a rabbi in the Gospels. But he said, "My teaching is not my own. It comes from him who sent me." So he, and he also put himself within the line of religion that people knew before him. He says, "If you'd believed in Moses, you would have believed in me, for he wrote about me." And Jesus also said he was there to fulfill the religion of the past, right? This is very similar to what Baha'u'llah is saying. It is the same as what Baha'u'llah is saying. "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law of the prophets. I have come to abolish them, not to abolish them, but to fulfill them," right? But then Jesus brought a new standard into the world. He was fulfilling he was claiming that he was coming from God, right? He was fulfilling the religions of the past. And then he is bringing a new standard into the world. He said, "You have heard that it was said to people long ago, you shall not murder. but anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. So Jesus brought a higher standard into the world, right? Not just don't kill each other. It's now you just don't get angry with each other, right? And that was Jesus's standard. Now, we certainly haven't lived up to that standard, but that was what he was bringing into the world, right? It was a fulfillment of the past, but it was a new standard. If you want to understand Baha'u'llah, this is exactly how you can understand Baha'u'llah. And, we have the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says that what we call the Beatitudes, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. The Beatitudes are, I think many Christians just memorize them. I mean, they're unbelievable, right? So, but Jesus described his place in his relation to God in two different ways. He said, I'm a messenger. And he said, my God who art in heaven, right? So he's on the earth. There's clear distinction between him and God. But then he also said, I and the Father are one, right? He said, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. So he's an infallible path to walking in the light, right? And then famously, he said, I am in the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me, right? Now, this is an interesting passage, and this is a passage that many Christians, and I grew up, and I would say I'm a Baha'i, and this is what I believe, and people would say, well, Jesus said he was the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. Did Jesus mean that only his religion forever would be the only religion that would be considered true? Or is that what he was saying? Or is he saying something else? And now that we have Baha'u'llah's revelation, we can actually understand that he was saying something a little bit different maybe than how Christians have traditionally interpreted this. Jesus also said that he would come again, right? I have many things to say unto you, but you cannot bear them now. Howbeit, when he who is the Spirit of truth is come, he will guide you into all truth. He shall not speak of himself, but whatsoever he shall hear, that shall he speak, and he will show you things to come. He shall glorify me, and he shall receive of mine, and shall show it unto you, right? So he promised one to come after him who would praise Jesus and would keep the same line of religion going, right? So it was a clear sense of he was going to come back, but he also didn't say it was him that was going to come back. It was going to be the Spirit of truth that would come back, right? So now Christianity, I'm trying to toggle between two ideas here because I want to get back to these theological ideas because, this is where a lot of folks that come from a Christian background are trying to understand the Baha'i faith and see it as consistent with Christianity struggle a bit. But I also want to talk about the impact of Christianity on the world, because I think by talking about the impact of Christianity on the world, we can get a sense of what Baha'u'llah's faith is all about and why, even though there's 7 million folks in the world and we struggle to get 10 people at a meeting, we actually think this religion's going to change the world. So what happened is that Christ's religion started out in the Mediterranean, right? And I don't have a pointer, but you see the Mediterranean there, and you look at Jordan and Syria and those countries, and it's in Jerusalem is nestled in between them in the Mediterranean Sea. And so for 300 years, it didn't really grow very much. It spread around that area, and then eventually became more and more well-known. And when it was allowed to join the pantheon of Roman gods, the emperor became a Christian, and then it spread and all of Rome became Christian. And then that, through the pathways the Romans had built, really spread up into Europe and beyond, right? But what was happening to Europe at that time? So Europe at that time was a large collection of different tribes and different peoples. Even the country of Scotland, for instance, had many different clans and tribes, and they didn't all speak the same language, right? So, even within Britain, for instance, there are several different native languages that were spoken in that area. So they not only saw each other, they were so different, even with that fairly small area. You had different language groups, right? And you had the Germanic language and the English and the French, and they're all speaking different languages. And they all worship different gods, right? So their gods were sort of like their tribal identity. And that was what we now refer to as polytheism, or paganism, I suppose, is, so that all these it became a tribal identity, kind of like a flag, or the symbol of an NFL team is for a collection of folks. It became sort of this identity. It was their gods, right? And Jesus's concept, and the concept that the Hebrew people had brought into the world, was this concept of the oneness of God, right? And this was a significant thing. And the oneness of God actually became the foundation for the unity of Europe. And it became the foundation, actually, for the growth of science, ultimately, because it was a conceptual foundation of a world that was orderly, and that was based on certain logical and rational principles that could then be, understood. And so there's this passage that's not very well known in the Bible, but I've always struck by it, where Jesus meets a woman from Samaria at the well. Samaritans were not Jews. They were similar to Jews, but they were not Jews. They worshipped a God that was separate from Jews, but they knew them. And, we know the story of the Good Samaritan, and how Jesus was illustrating that people who were non-Jewish could do good, right? And because most of his followers were Jewish and had prejudice against non-Jews. So he was explaining to them, but he met with this woman, and the first thing she says to him is, you're talking to me, but you're Jewish. You're not supposed to talk to me, right? So there was such a distinction between Samaritans and Jews, and such a prejudice, that she was even surprised that he was even bothering to talk with her, because most of the time the Jews wouldn't talk to a Samaritan. But she asked him questions about the nature of what he was teaching and so forth. And he made a distinction. He says, you Samaritans worship what you do not know, but we worship what we do know. He said, and time is coming and has now come when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship him in spirit and truth. So he said, the God that you worship, that we worship, and that I want you to worship, is not in the mountain. And he's not in the temple in Jerusalem. He's a spirit. He's an abstract God, right? So this fundamental idea of the oneness of God became so significant, and really, that was really the foundational idea of Western civilization, right? And Jesus is expressing it here. It's not a physical thing. God's not a physical thing. God is a spirit. God is an abstract concept. And this idea spread throughout Europe. Nobody's going to claim that this was the civilization of Europe, and Christianity was always an easy thing or a good thing or anything else. And there was a lot of fighting. But the reality is that as these monks and these priests went up throughout Europe, and started to establish centers of learning, universities, monasteries, they started teaching people how to read and write. They started, they built over hundreds of years the structure that would ultimately become, the structure upon which all of Europe became educated. And it was really that and Greek philosophy that really made Europe the civilizing force that it would become. And it was because of these concepts that Jesus had brought into the world. So Jesus did not build a nation. Jesus did not build a religion. Jesus built a civilization, right? And he did that by giving them a conceptual foundation for themselves that allowed them to unite across the divides that they had been fighting about for years. Even though they were different languages, they could start to understand each other as followers of one God who would unite them, and they were Christian in that regard. Baha'u'llah talks about the influence of Jesus as a civilizing force, right? In a passage that he had written actually to an Orthodox priest who had asked him questions. Baha'u'llah refers to Jesus in a way that I'm not even sure Christians really appreciate. He says, know that when the Son of Man is a title for Jesus from the Bible, when the Son of Man yielded up his breath to God and was sacrificed on the cross, the whole creation wept with a great weeping. He said, but by sacrificing himself, a fresh capacity was infused into all created things. And then Baha'u'llah goes on to say, he says, the deepest wisdoms which the sages have uttered, the profoundest learning which any mind has unfolded, the arts which the ablest hands have produced, the influence exerted by the most potent of rulers, are but manifestations of the quickening power, of the reviving power released by his transcendent, his all-pervasive and resplendent spirit. Blessed is he who with a face beaming with light has turned towards him. Jesus, from Baha'u'llah's perspective, this is, we have that passage of Jesus that when the Spirit of truth comes back into the world, he will praise him. And this is it, right? The significant passage. But it's not just reading a book of Jesus' teachings and being inspired. Baha'u'llah suggests that there's a force behind that. He releases a force that has its effect in many different ways. And in very subtle ways across all creation. So I want to come back to this passage that many folks get tripped up on as they understand the Baha'i faith, and how Jesus is viewed by Baha'is when he made this very specific statement: I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you know me, you will know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. And I'd like to point out that this was really in the context in this discussion in the Gospels where, Jesus was telling his followers that he was going to die soon, and they wanted to be with him and they didn't want him to leave. And he says, I'm going to the next world. I'm going to prepare a place for you. And then he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father but through me. If you know me, you know the Father, right? From now on, you do know him and you have seen him. So, this is a true statement. Obviously, it's the word of God, but it's not controversial for Baha'is because Baha'u'llah explained that, that our understanding of God is filtered to us through the messengers of God. Okay, they translate, if you will, into human terms the truths of God's for us to understand. I mean, we're living in this little planet and circling a sun that's like innumerable other suns out there, right? We're a small part of a very large universe, all of which is created by God, right? So how are we, who grew up in this little small niche of the universe, going to understand the nature of the creator who brought it all into being? We can't, right? We can't in any direct sense. And so, what Baha'u'llah explains to us is that it's really through the messengers of God, through the manifestations of God, and they are the greatest expression of his will in humanity. And in a famous passage, Baha'u'llah says, we're any of the all-embracing manifestations of God, meaning Christ, Jesus, the Prophet Muhammad, and so forth, to say, I am God. He speaks the truth, because it has been repeatedly demonstrated that through their revelation, their attributes, the revelation of God, his names and attributes are made manifest in the world. So when the Prophet Muhammad said God is the merciful and the compassionate, he's talking about the qualities of human beings that reflect the qualities of God. It's those, we understand God through very human qualities that the manifestations of God reflect. They are, they're not God, but they're God to us, and they reflect the qualities of God in a way that we can understand. And, there's a beautiful passage in the writings of Baha'u'llah's forerunner, the Bab, where he said, there's no paradise more wondrous for any soul than to be exposed to God's manifestations, like to be in the presence of Jesus or to the Prophet Muhammad, to hear his verses, to believe in him, to attain his presence, which is the same as being in the presence of God, the highest station that we can achieve as human beings, to sail upon the sea of the heavenly kingdom of his good pleasure and partake of the choice fruits of the paradise of his divine oneness. So, and every one of these great religions every one of them is the way of God that connects this world, the world we live in, and the realms above. They are the standard of God's truth for all creation. And their messengers are the manifestations of God. They manifest the qualities of God, the evidences of his truth and the signs of his glory. So Baha'u'llah made religion very coherent and explained that all creation reflects the nature of God. But these messengers of God reflect it most precisely, most specifically for us as human beings. So my father became a Baha'i, and he studied it for 3 years, and he was deeply enthralled by it, and remained a Baha'i all his life, and made great efforts to try and be of service to it. But he had one challenge when he was studying the Baha'i faith as a young man coming from a Christian background. He could accept Baha'u'llah easily. He said, Baha'u'llah is not a problem. He said, I'm having trouble with the Prophet Muhammad. And it was very interesting. And this is true from a lot of folks from Christian background, because we don't get raised with an understanding of Islam. It's a religion that seems foreign to us. It's an other, and so forth. And I had the same issue coming as a Christian and then as a Baha'i. I didn't really know anything about Islam. And it's interesting because my introduction to Islam was through the Baha'i writings. Baha'u'llah would quote the Quran, or we would quote the great Islamic mystics and poets in some of his earlier writings. And because he was trying to explain his faith to people who came from that background, and he would use the language and the expressions that they understood in order to explain his teachings to them. And I had a very positive impression of Islam through my reading of Baha'u'llah's writings, because there was so much wisdom and beauty that he would express in these words. And so, but I didn't know anything about Islam as a primary thing. And if you look at the map of the world, the purple is where Christianity is dominant. So Christianity is dominant religion in the world. But the gray is largely Islam and then China. I mean, so Islam is a big deal, right? And it's in between Christ and Baha'u'llah, right? There's the Prophet Muhammad, who's 600 or 700 years after Christ. So what do we do theologically with the Prophet Muhammad? When you study Islam and you study its teachings, you understand that its role in all of this and how it really led to Baha'u'llah. And I want to explain to you what I came to understand about it. So Islam was, the Prophet Muhammad revealed his religion in what is now modern day Saudi Arabia. It's right in the middle of the screen there. And it spread out from there. It spread into North Africa. It spread into Iran, down into India. Almost all of India was Muslim at one point. And now Pakistan is Muslim. It spread up into the western side of China, into the lower areas of Russia. And we see these effects all now. And it spread into Europe. And Spain was Muslim for many centuries. So it was, and one of the things you want to say about Islam, it's important to understand, Islamic civilization was the greatest civilization on earth for 700 years. I mean, this was not a subtle amount of time where Islamic civilization was the most progressive, the most evolved, the most developed civilization during that period. So if we want to understand world history, and God speaks to the world, he doesn't speak to us just who grew up Christian and had that own perspective. He speaks to the world, right? So, there was a long period of time where this Islamic civilization and was the greatest civilization. And it was really built by the Prophet Muhammad. Remember, I said manifestations of God did not build nations or religions. They build civilizations, right? And so that's it. And it came out of the desert, and it came out within a couple hundred years. The Muslims had gone from turning Arabia, which was considered a backwater, really, of tribal religions, into a civilizing force unlike the world had ever seen. And it was all because of the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad. So what did the Prophet Muhammad say? So the Prophet Muhammad did an interesting thing. So he was a unifier in a way that was remarkable. And he was very humble, if you will, and made a distinction between himself as the prophet and God. Very clear distinction, a clearer distinction than Christ had made, or what was at least handed down in the Gospels that Christ had made. And he said, I am just the prophet. I reveal the word of God to you. He even made a distinction between himself and the Quran, which was his recitations. And, there's the stories where, he would say something and his followers would say, well, is that a recitation or is that something you're saying? He made it such a clear, no, this is what I'm saying. And, Muslims would eventually make a distinction between the sayings of the prophet said as a prophet and what was actually revealed to him, whose voice was God. And so, Muslims would say, God, as God said in the Quran, whereas the Prophet Muhammad would sometimes give advice that was his own advice. And so, the prophet did it in that way to create unity among people, right? So in the Quran, God addresses the Prophet Muhammad, and he says what his role is. He says, O prophet, we have sent thee as a witness, as a bearer of glad tidings, as a warner, as a summoner to God by his command, and as a lamp that gives bright light, right? And today I have perfected your religion for you. I have completed my blessing upon you. I have approved Islam for your religion. So what does Islam mean? Islam means submission. And what the Prophet said, that anyone who submits themselves to God is a Muslim. And he included in that Jews and Christians, right? So Islam is a monotheistic religion. Its main issue, its main theme was that people needed to become and worship this abstract one God, that same God that Jesus had talked to at the well with the Samaritan woman, right? It's a continuation of that same process. And, by using that, he said all people who have submitted to God are Muslim, and they are followers of Islam. So Christ was a Muslim. Moses was a Muslim. They had submitted their will to the will of God. And if you do the same, you will be a Muslim too. That's what it meant to be a follower of Islam. Islam was a religion of submission. It was submitting your will to God. This allowed Islam to be this ecumenical, universal religion. So for its time, it was this really universal religion. People gave up their tribal religions to worship one God. And in so doing, they began to understand all of religion as one religion, right? So Islam was really a continuation of the same theme that Jesus had brought into the world, that he was fulfilling the religion of the past and yet broadening it out, right? And so Baha'u'llah is doing the same thing, by the way. It's the same process. And it's a process that unifies. More and more people, as they begin to see themselves as part of this, begin to see one God leads to unity, right? Now, people become tribal about stuff, and Islam has become tribal, just like all things. But, we're talking about things that hold stuff together, not that what pulls it apart. What pulls it apart, we all know. It's the same thing that's pulled it apart in Europe. It's the same thing that pulls it apart now. People become tribal about the identities. It's the same reason Congress can't figure out a speaker. They become tribal with their identities, right? It's the same reason that the Jews and the Muslims are fighting in Israel today, right? People become tribal with their identities. That's not what the religion of God has been. The force has been one of unity, always, to try and unify. And the Prophet Muhammad used the language of that time to build people closer to a world of unity. And he said, and I have to move this out of the way so I can see my own slide. If you do love God, follow me. God will love you and forgive you your sins, for God is the ever forgiving and the most merciful. That could have been in the Bible. That could have been in the words of Jesus, right? This is one passage that very much impressed me, and I want to share it with you because I think it's important. Because, we talked about Jesus at the well, and this is a really important passage from the nephew and son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad. So Ali ibn Talib, and I don't know the pronunciation exactly, and someone may correct me, but Ali, as he is known, the number two name in the world is Ali. Baha'u'llah was born with the name Ali, Hussein Ali. He was named after this individual. who was extraordinarily important in Islam. It's like, in Christianity, it's the Apostle Paul who really kind of gave form to the religion of Christianity and advised these churches. Ali played that role for the Prophet Muhammad and his religion. And his words are so interesting. It's really wonderful to study the life of Ali. And he was such a noble, progressive, forward thinker, and how he explained Islam. But he explained God. And this is really important because people get tripped up on this. He said, God is not like any object the human mind can conceive. This is 600 AD, folks, by the way. No attribute can be ascribed to him which bears the least resemblance to any quality of which human beings have perception from their knowledge of material objects, right? Baha'u'llah will express this years later as God is unknowable, right? We understand things based on how they relate to material objects because that's how our minds work. We live in this world, but God's not in that world, right? God's has no resemblance to anything in that world. It's not materialistic in any way. And then I love this passage. He refers to God. He says, he is with every object, but not from resemblance or nearness. He is outside everything, but not from separation or indifference towards his creatures. He works and creates, but not in the meaning of motions or actions. He has no relation to matter, time, and space, right? That's a really remarkable statement, right? And it has us to understand that this is a modern understanding of God. I mean, it's 650 AD or so that Ali would have said these words. And we should all read this when we're trying to understand God, because we think about God in terms that we understand, but we have to also recognize that's not what God actually is. And when we talk about the will of God manifesting in the world, it's not in a sense of motions or actions. We're not going to be able to measure it as a scientific force, right? It doesn't have any connection to any of the scientific forces that we know, which are all in relation to matter, time, and space, right? So when Baha'u'llah says that Jesus' impact upon the artists and the wisdom of the great thinkers and so forth, it's not in that sense of, it's not in a material sense. It's in a way that we can never fully understand, and only the manifestations of God can really sort of help us appreciate. So Islam, as I said, became the greatest religion in the world for over 700 years, and was so formative. And Islam was an ecumenical religion and brought in so many different lines of perspective on God. The great mystics of Islam, particularly in Iran, who were the poets and mystics, they were influenced by India and the mystics of India, or vice versa. When you look at the literature of Islam, it's got so many different levels. And when Baha'u'llah came into the world, he was able to speak to this broad religious concepts because he came to the people of Islam. And that's why Islam is so important. It really built upon the teachings of the past. But for Muslims, there's a challenging passage as well. Just as Christians have this difficulty with Jesus saying, I am the way, the truth, the life, and nobody gets to the Father but through me, Muslims have a similar kind of challenge. And that is that, similar to Christians, they have interpreted a passage in the Quran as Muhammad saying he was the last prophet and that he would not come into the world, which was kind of antithetical, if you will, to the whole process he had explained about the nature of religion. It was like, well, yes, it's built all these years, and Christianity was true and Judaism was true, and now I'm here, and then it drops off a cliff and nothing ever happens after that, right? But they interpreted a passage from the Quran where the prophet says, or the Quran says, Muhammad is not the father of any of your men, but he is the messenger of God and the seal of the prophets, and God has full knowledge of all things. Now, this term, the seal of the prophets, somewhat nebulous. It could mean different things. It could mean when you break the seal on a wine, It could mean a seal that you stamp a letter with, right? That Muhammad was the symbol, if you will, of the prophethood and what that meant. Or it could mean it's a cap on the top, right? That it's not going to come anymore. And it's always been interpreted as a cap on the top. that when Muhammad perfected the religion, and it would not, now no religion would come after the Prophet Muhammad. And so this was obviously a major problem for Baha'u'llah, revealing a religion within Islamic society who all believed that the Prophet Muhammad was the last prophet and nothing would happen after that. And so Baha'u'llah answers this question in many different passages. And this is not specifically one of them, but I wanted to use this one. But basically what Baha'u'llah says is, wait a minute, and he doesn't say it this way. This is going to be my terrible paraphrase. He says, wait a minute, we're talking about God here, right? The process of God's creation has had no beginning and it can have no end. This is an unfolding religion throughout time. This isn't something that you just put a cap on and say, you put it in the bottle and put it up on the shelf and say, that's it. It doesn't happen that way, right? So, and that's basically what Baha'u'llah says when he explains this. And he gives other interpretations and other explanations, but I love this passage and I wanted to share it with you because I think it also connects so much with other things. He says, a drop of the billowing ocean of God's endless mercy has adorned all creation with an ornament of existence. Yeah, I was sorry. Good grief. Somebody called me and it threw off my thing. I'm going to go back in. Oh boy. Are you guys still seeing my screen? There we are. Okay, we're back. A drop of the billowing ocean of his endless mercy has adorned all creation with the ornament of its existence, and a breath wafted from his peerless paradise has invested all beings with the robe of his sanctity and glory. A sprinkling of the unfathomed deep of his sovereign and all-pervasive will has out of utter nothingness called into being a creation which is infinite in its range and deathless in its duration. Deathless in its duration. The wonders of his bounty can never cease. The stream of his merciful grace can never be arrested. The process of his creation hath had no beginning and can have no end. Baha'u'llah tells us that creation is constantly being created. It emanates from God like the sun, the rays of the sun emanate from the sun. It's not that God intervened in the world at one point, set an end to existence, and everything is followed from there. It is constantly in a process of creation. We live in the most majestic and magnificent place, right? And so that's the argument he gives for understanding the seal of the prophets. He says, it's not possible. Look at the nature of the world. And so that, though, becomes a setting up to understanding a lot from a scientific perspective. It's a completely different theology. As I said, we need to rethink religion entirely, because when you think about religion in this way, there really isn't a conflict with science. You understand that more. Okay, so this area right in the middle of is Iran, and that's where Baha'u'llah revealed his religion. And it was really the epicenter of a lot of these forces that we've seen. So I wanted to make the point, and I want to make it explicitly, that, as I said, these prophets, these manifestations of God, they build civilizations, right? And if you think about civilization, what is it, right? I'm going to say civilization is the process of translating abstract ideals like justice, right? Mercy, kindness, abstract ideals into a societal organization that reflects those ideals. And Baha'u'llah tells us that we live in an ever-advancing civilization, right? This is a very dynamic concept, evolutionary concept. And he tells us to apply yourselves to the problems of the day in which you live, knowing that you can't solve the problems in the past, you're not going to solve the problems in the future. You need to focus on today. But what we're doing when we're trying to come together in unity in what we call successful, peaceful civilization is more and more translate abstract ideals into societal organization, right? And that's what these folks were doing. I want to say these guys. I was going to say these folks, but these are all guys, unfortunately, right? So that's what these guys were doing. But these are the guys who signed the Declaration of Independence. And they said, we're going to build a new country and we're going to build it on ideals, right? With liberty and justice for all, right? That was as a result of everything that had happened in the 2 centuries before with Christianity and the building of humanity's appreciation of abstract ideals. You could not have done that based on the tribes that in Europe that existed. You needed hundreds of years of people being educated in abstract ideals before you could get to the point where you sign a document that says we're not going to be identified by our king. We're not going to be identified by this authoritarian figure. We're going to be identified by the principles that we enshrine in our Constitution, right? And so that's the society and it became the most successful organization of society that we've ever seen, right? And I wanted to just focus for a second on Thomas Jefferson, because Thomas Jefferson encapsulates a lot of what was happening and what has happened in understanding our world. So Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. We all know that. He was an Enlightenment thinker. He was really in many ways the personification of that period in history we call the Enlightenment. And he was a deeply religious man. And he spent a lot of his time going back through at nighttime. He would go back and he rewrote the Bible. He took out passages, literally cutting them out of the Bible. He didn't rewrite it. He re-edited it. He cut out from the Bible the passages that he thought reflected the ideals of Christianity. And he took out all the miracle stories because as an enlightened thinker, he was very uncomfortable with these things which he saw as superstitious, right? And this is a lot of the reason people have turned away from Christianity, because it seems a little superstitious with Jesus going around and healing the sick and so forth. And Jefferson had his own problems with it. But he said the essence of it are these beautiful ideas, right? And that's what he built. So I think that, in many ways, and he's the maker of the Declaration of Independence, it's explicitly how he was inspired, right? Was based on the ideals that Christ had brought into the world. But yet there's also an element of that he was uncomfortable with some of the elements of the Bible, because in some ways his society had moved beyond that. It was very convincing to the European tribal peoples that Jesus had healed the sick, right? These were people that lived in a world where they believed in all kinds of demons and all kinds of things. They were very superstitious. And the fact that Jesus had healed the sick was a major way that they actually sort of their portal of entry to understanding him as a great man, right? That they should follow. So the miracle stories were really helpful for them, right? To understanding Jesus. And then they found that pathway to all the beautiful things that Jesus said. But it was also problematic later. And so later, what happened is that more and more people started to turn away from religion, especially in the 19th century. Part of it was because religion itself had become very tribal and caused very wars in Europe. And we had these great thinkers that came, the angry white men, Ludwig Feuerbach, Sigmund Freud, Bertrand Russell, Charles Darwin, Friedrich Nietzsche. All of these were these great figures who sort of spoke out against religion. What I will point out, and I don't think I'm going to have time because I can see I'm running over a little bit, is that all of the arguments that they gave were really countered by the understanding that Baha'u'llah came into the world to bring. That you can understand, in many cases they were right. They just didn't understand this broader perspective that Baha'u'llah brought into the world. So, this brings us to a key concept in the Baha'i faith, and that is that just as religions become new and they bring all this beautiful stuff into the world and they bring unity, they go through a period of winter. They fade. And so, Baha'is expect the great religions of humanity to fade. We were told they would fade. Abdu'l-Baha, who gave wonderful analogies and metaphors to understand religion, said that religions go through a period of spring when they're fresh and new. And as Baha'is, we're in that period now. And then there's summer where everybody appreciates how wonderful it is. And then fall, there starts to be some problems. And the leaves, it gets to a point where the tree is dying, if you will. And then the winter comes, where all you see is the structures, right? Their trees have no leaves. All that's left are just the outward forms, if you will, of the trees. The leaves are all gone. The spring has gone. The summer has passed. Fall has gone. And now spring comes again. And that spring coming again is when a new messenger of God comes into the world. But you also have to have the winter. And so when we see when we see the religions of the past and what they're suffering through now and why people are turning away from them, it's because they feel that they don't have the same beauty and spirit that they once had. They're just the shallow, if you will, forms of that. Okay. So when Abdu'l-Baha came to the US and lectured in these, you can read all of his talks in a book called Promulgation of Universal Peace. And he talks about this all throughout that, explaining the nature of religion and how the religion has been renewed and what that means for the world. I love this quote. I'm getting towards the end and I'm getting late and I'm sorry, but it's from Abdu'l-Baha. And he says, religion is the outer expression of God. Therefore, it must be vital. It must be living, vitalized, moving, and progressive. If it be without motion, it is non-progressive, and it is without the divine spirit, it is dead. The divine institutions are continuously active and evolutionary. Therefore, the revelation of them must be progressive and continuous, right? This is a perception of religion as being, always striving to be ahead and modern and so forth. And Baha'u'llah set up his religion in order to administratively be structured so that it could adapt to the times. But even the religions themselves, they need constant renewal if they are to reflect what is God, and because God is constantly creating, right? Baha'u'llah says and then Baha'u'llah tells us in his words that this is a beautiful time in history. It's a wonderful time. And he says, this is the day where on the ocean of God's mercy has been manifested unto men, the day in which the day star, like the sun of his loving kindness, hath shed its radiance upon them, the day in which the clouds of his bountiful favor have overshadowed the whole of mankind. And he says, now is the time to cheer and refresh the downcast through the invigorating breeze of love and fellowship and the living waters of friendliness and charity. When a manifestation comes into the world, it's the spring has come, right? Everything's coming to life. And we're reflected in that. And he says something I think is one of the most significant passages for me of the writings of Baha'u'llah. He says what his faith is about. He says, "O you children of men, the fundamental purpose animating the faith of his God and his religion is to safeguard the interest and promote the unity of the human race, and to foster the spirit of love and fellowship among men. Suffer it not to be the source of dissension and discord, of hate and enmity." This is a warning, right? This is its purpose. Use it for its purpose. This is the straight path, the fixed and immovable foundation, right? You're going to build a structure or a civilization or a religion. This is what you build it on, the unity and love and fellowship. Whatsoever is raised on that foundation, on this foundation, the changes and chances of the world cannot impair its strength, nor will the revolution of countless centuries undermine its structure. So he's telling the Baha'is, really, the fundamental purpose of your religion is to bring unity. Don't mess it up, right? And if you do that, and if you keep that foundation, it will be able to handle the challenges that it faces as civilization progresses. Okay. Baha'u'llah tells us his religion is not just for one people. He says the summons and the message which we gave were never, by the way, he uses the word we, it's the royal we, not that he's more than one person, but in religious language, the Quran and other places, when God reveals directly, he says we, and that means God, basically. The summons and the message which we gave were never intended to reach or benefit one land or one people only. Mankind in its entirety must firmly to adhere to whoever has been revealed, and then and only then will it attain unto true liberty. So we live in this beautiful world, this beautiful planet that we can now see as being one place. We don't want division anymore. We've had success in building societies that are diverse and peaceful, and we want to spread this kind of thing around the world. When I say we, I mean we as humanity, right? We want to greater spread it. The Baha'i faith is really in line with, I think, the great movement of our culture of what's generally referred to as liberalism, I suppose, of building societies that are based on abstract ideals and that bring unity and allow us to solve our problems productively. Baha'u'llah asked us to not, as we build those societies, to see ourselves as one global family, and that as one global organism too, so that one part is falling and failing or one part is oppressed, it affects the whole organism. It's a disease for the whole organism. And so we need to build societies that. There's a wonderful passage of Baha'u'llah where he says, God's will, he says, he who is your Lord, the all-merciful, desires in his heart to see all the peoples of the world as one family. That was a bad, yeah. Those of you who are Baha'is know I just butchered that. But that to see, desires the whole world as one. I messed it up. I should have written it down. I'm sorry. But God wants us to all be united, right? And that's his deepest desire for all of us. So anything that we do that really is against that mission is really against God's will. All right. I'm going to end my talk there, somewhat belatedly. I'm sorry.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bayan.
It was great. I think you covered a lot of the main, major points of the Baha'i faith and what really makes it important for today, especially.
Yeah.
We have time for a few questions. So if you have a question, you can put it in the chat and I will read it out. We already have one question that asks, what did the Prophet Muhammad mean by Seal of the Prophets?
That's actually a good question. What did the Prophet Muhammad mean by Seal of the Prophets? It's interesting. I don't know of a passage in the writings where Baha'u'llah specifically says that. You know, the Prophet gave himself many titles, and that was one of them. I don't know that I don't know that I've ever seen anything authoritatively from Baha'u'llah that says exactly what the meaning was, only that it didn't mean the last one, because that's not possible.
And someone else said in the chat that in the Book of Certitude of Baha'u'llah,
Yes,
there are some paragraphs that talk about that.
There are, and that's true. The Book of Certitude is Baha'u'llah's major theological work that answers a lot of the questions that priests and other followers had at this time about the claims of him and the Bab who was before him, and how a new religion could come into the world and so forth. It's an amazing book, and there are some lovely passages in there about that, and I would refer everyone to that, because Baha'u'llah does address the Seal of the Prophets issue. I guess my point is, I don't want to say, I don't have the authority to say what the Prophet Muhammad meant by the Seal of the Prophets, but I would direct everybody there. Yeah.
Thank you. We have another question. Could you please explain the difference when you mentioned that God both emanates or creates new things and he also manifests?
Yes. So they're different ideas. So the creation, God does not emanate, creation emanates from God. And it's a concept of the way Abdu'l-Baha explained it is that as the light emanates from the sun, but is separate from the sun, and yet a reflection of the nature of the sun, that's what creation is in relation to God. But emanation is a constant process, right? As opposed to building a building. Like, you know, one of the ways that was historically understood based on some of the creation ideas in the early part of the Bible, that God had created the world and then set it rolling, you know, and there's a creation in time. And Baha'u'llah said, you know, actually creation emanates from God and is constantly in the process of being created effectively. And so the manifestations of God, and Baha'u'llah said something very interesting, and he's very clear about this, that, you know, everything manifests the attributes of God, right? God doesn't appear in the world in the same way that a painter never appears in the painting, right? The painter always remains separate from the painting, but everything in the painting reflects the painter, right? And so the world, as we see it, the beauty of the world, the diversity of the world, the beauty of nature, all of that is spiritual, right? All of that is reflection of God. And, so in that way, everything manifests God. But there is a sense in which God actually does manifest to us, and that's what the manifestations of God or the messengers of God are doing, is that, we're human beings. It's not sufficient for us to learn just based on the nature of the world itself. We learn about God through that, but he says we're also given guidance through the revelations of God, and they manifest the qualities of God. So, for instance, let me give you an example that might make this a little more clear. Everything expresses the will of God in creation. So nature I just said this, it's a manifestation with a little m, if you will. But how would we know, for instance, that God is merciful and compassionate? When we see one animal eating another, or the way humans have treated each other, how do we know that God is not, some kid trying to make fun of another kid, and using us as some sort of example? How do we know any of these things that a lot of the atheist thinkers have brought up? The answer to that from a Baha'i perspective is that we know it because of the manifestations of God. And they are the ones who manifest the qualities. And so, every chapter in the Quran gives, Allah is the compassionate, the all-merciful. That is reminding us, and all these Baha'i prayers who end with, "O thou who art the compassionate, the merciful, the kind, the just, the fair," all of these things. What are these? These are qualities of God that we manifest in our lives and reflect God. They're qualities of us. They're a translation. So we know what God is, but we also know what we should be. And so we know about the relationship of God to us because that's what because the manifestations of God tell us what the relation of God to us is. And that we should see all creation as a good thing. I hope that answered the question. It was long-winded.
Thank you. We have another question asking, how do you respond to someone saying that they don't like organized religion?
Yeah, it's a famous, I used to go to it. There's a lovely Baha'i named Bob Harris who lives in New Jersey. He had a leadership role in the Baha'i community for years. And he would say, if anybody doesn't like organized religion, they should come to one of our meetings, because we'd always be disorganized. We don't like disorganized religion either, right? Yeah, it's interesting because I think that everything reflects God. All of creation reflects God. But you're missing out, I think, if you don't connect with one of the manifestations of God. And they manifest themselves. I mean, the purpose of their religions is to help organize people around certain ideas that they then do good in the world. And they unify the world based on those principles. So, the revelations of God are a participatory exercise. We need to get engaged and become part of it. And through that, you grow and you face challenges. I mean, I've grown a lot as a person being a Baha'i. I had to, answer a lot of questions myself. And so I think you lose the opportunity for that if you don't participate in that with others. And staying outside of it, I think, stunts our growth a little bit. But it's not just about joining any religion. You have to join a religion that fits your beliefs and fits your goals and ideals. But folks need to go at their own pace. We're not, I've been times in my life, I've been very involved in the Baha'i community. Times in my life, I haven't been as involved because of work responsibilities or other things. And that's okay, but you miss out if you don't join in with others.
Thank you. Well, I think that's all the time we have for questions today. I want to thank you again for your talk. I think it's something that everybody can go back to again and again to, revisit all these major points of the Baha'i faith. So thank you.
Thank you, Bayan. Thank you. And to your sisters and your mom for doing all of this for us and putting this on. It's really a great bounty for everyone.
Of course. So now I will introduce our speaker for next week. Our speaker next week is going to be Dr. Haide Sabet, and her topic is going to be A Tribute to the Life and Station of Baha'u'llah. And again, these talks are every Saturday at noon Eastern Daylight Time, so you can invite your friends and family. Thank you, everyone. Hope to see you all next Saturday. Have a great week. Bye.
Bye.